By the early months of 1944, Europe had endured nearly 5 years beneath the shadow of war. Entire nations lived under occupation. Streets once alive with laughter now echoed with soldiers' boots and the cries of the hungry. In the cities of France, in the villages of Belgium, in the ruins of Warsaw, the continent seemed to hold its breath. For those who dreamed of liberation, salvation could only come from across the sea. And for those across the channel, the time had come to answer that call. The Allies knew that the war could not be won by bombing raids alone, nor by slow advances up the spine of Italy. If Hitler's empire was to be broken, they would have to return to Western Europe. They would have to attempt what no army had dared for nearly a millennium: the crossing of the English Channel in the face of a hostile power. What they planned would be the greatest seaborne invasion in human history. The name given to it was simple, but the weight it carried was immense: Operation Overlord. Yet across the water, within the councils of Hitler's Reich, doubt and division quietly undermined the German response. The Nazi leadership had long boasted of an impregnable Atlantic wall fortress of concrete and steel stretching from Norway's icy fjords to the beaches of southern France. But behind the propaganda lay bitter disagreements. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the seasoned veteran who commanded all German forces in the West, believed that no wall of fortifications could truly stop an invasion. He argued that the Allies, once ashore, could not be dislodged. The only hope, he said, was to keep Germany's armored divisions intact, to hold them back until the enemy revealed his hand, and then unleash a decisive counterblow. But another figure had been summoned to the Western Front: Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox. Rommel had seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa. He was convinced that if the invaders were allowed to land in strength, they would overwhelm Germany's defenses before any counterattack could be organized. To him, the solution was clear: meet the invasion at the beaches themselves, smash it in its opening moments, and drive it back into the sea. Two of Germany's most skilled commanders locked in disagreement. And above them both, a Führer increasingly detached from military reality. Adolf Hitler insisted that his Atlantic wall was unbreakable, a fortress that would render the channel impassable. Yet even as propaganda films extolled the strength of its bunkers, thousands of miles of shoreline remained poorly defended. Concrete had been poured, steel obstacles planted, mines buried in sand, but the wall was riddled with gaps. Rommel knew it, Rundstedt knew it, but Hitler would not hear it. In the occupied towns of northern France, meanwhile, the human cost of the Reich's defensive ambitions was being paid in silence. Villagers were conscripted to labor on fortifications. Farmers watched their fields being dug up for tank traps. Resistance networks whispered of Allied landings that might come any day, though no one could be sure when or where. To them, the Atlantic Wall was not just a line of concrete and steel. It was the symbol of a prison from which only the Allies could set them free. In London, preparations continued in secret. Deception operations Operation Fortitude sought to convince the Germans that the blow would fall not at Normandy, but at Calais. Fake armies of inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft appeared along the English coast. Radio chatter was staged, false intelligence planted. German commanders remained convinced that the Pas-de-Calais, the closest point across the channel, was the real target. This deception would prove decisive. By the spring of 1944, the storm was gathering. Allied harbors filled with landing craft, supply depots swelled with fuel and ammunition, airfields roared with the engines of thousands of planes. Across the channel, Rommel paced the beaches, ordering more mines, more obstacles, more bunkers. Rundstedt argued with his staff about the positioning of the panzer divisions. Hitler dreamed of his fortress wall stretching unbroken to the horizon. And all the while, millions waited. Soldiers in English camps rehearsed endlessly for a battle they could not yet see. Civilians in occupied France held fast to rumors that freedom was coming. German conscripts shivered in half-built bunkers, wondering what would happen when the storm finally broke. The invasion of Normandy had not yet begun, but already the fate of Europe hung in the balance. In the winter of 1944, under the long shadow of occupation, the people of Europe clung to a fragile hope. For 5 long years, their days had been measured out by curfews, ration cards, and the ever-present risk of a knock at the door. Posters of German soldiers watched from the walls of occupied cities. Propaganda blared from radios in village squares. Yet beneath the silence, whispers stirred. Whispers that somewhere across the channel, an army was gathering. Whispers that one day, the tide would turn. For the people of France, the hope of liberation was both a lifeline and a torment. Few could say when it might come, or if they would even live to see it. But in the flicker of candlelight, in the hidden rooms where the resistance gathered, they spoke of a day when the Allies would return. They called it the Second Front. Underground newspapers printed on smuggled presses, distributed at risk of death, spread rumors of an invasion. Some were filled with cautious optimism, others with bitter reminders of past betrayals. In 1942, after all, a great Allied landing had been promised in France, only for the effort to shift instead to North Africa. In 1943, another promise, another delay. Stalin, in Moscow, pressed constantly for a second front to relieve the Red Army, while in Paris, whispers of Allied indecision spread disillusionment. But still the dream endured. The French resistance, fragmented yet determined, played its dangerous part. Some were Gaullists, loyal to the Free French leader in London. Others followed the communists, hardened by years of clandestine struggle. Still others resisted with no politics at all, driven only by the instinct to oppose the occupier. They sabotaged railways, cut telephone wires, mapped German defenses, and passed coded messages to London. Every act of defiance risked brutal retaliation. The Gestapo's reach was long, and informants lurked everywhere. Entire villages could be burned for the actions of a few. Yet still, men and women, often little more than boys and girls, carried out their missions, knowing full well that capture meant torture and death. Among them were women, whose contributions have often been overlooked in the grand narratives of war. They carried messages on bicycles, smuggled weapons under their skirts, and hid Allied pilots in barns and attics. In cities like Lyon and Toulouse, female couriers threaded their way through checkpoints with coded instructions sewn into their clothing. In Paris, women printed clandestine newspapers while German patrols marched outside. These acts, small in scale, yet immense in courage, helped keep the dream of liberation alive when it might otherwise have died. But resistance came at a terrible cost. For every act of sabotage, the Germans struck back with ruthless ferocity. Hostages were shot, villages were razed, and whole communities were punished. In Oradour-sur-Glane, the SS would later wipe out an entire town, massacring more than 600 civilians. Even before D-Day, the memory of such atrocities hung heavily over occupied France. To resist was to risk not only your own life, but the lives of your neighbors. It was a burden almost unimaginable, yet still borne by thousands. Across Europe, too, the hope of liberation took many forms. In Belgium, underground cells plotted against their occupiers. In the Netherlands, families starved in the hunger winter but still hid Jews and downed airmen from German patrols. In Norway, fishermen carried secret passengers across the icy seas. In Greece and Yugoslavia, partisans fought in the mountains, tying down German divisions that might otherwise have been sent to France. Everywhere, the dream of liberation became a thread that bound disparate peoples together, fragile yet unbroken. And what of those in the German-occupied territories who looked on with despair, or even with collaboration? Liberation was not a simple promise for all. Some feared retribution for their compromises under occupation. Others dreaded the bombing campaigns that already scarred the landscape. In Normandy itself, farmers wondered if their homes would survive the storm that was surely coming. For them, the approach of the Allies was both hope and terror. In London, the exiled governments of Europe, Polish, Czech, Dutch, Belgian, and Norwegian, watched anxiously. Each knew that the fate of their nations depended on the Allies making good on their long-promised invasion. And for Charles de Gaulle, the leader of Free France, the stakes were personal. He feared that if the Allies liberated France without him, France might wake from its nightmare only to find itself reduced to a puppet of foreign powers. Thus, for de Gaulle, D-Day was not only the promise of liberation but the chance to restore France's honor and independence. In the skies over occupied Europe, Allied bombers flew nightly raids, pounding railway yards, factories, and bridges. Officially, these strikes were meant to weaken German defenses in preparation for invasion. But to those on the ground, the thunder of bombs carried its own grim message: that freedom would not come without destruction. French civilians died by the tens of thousands in these raids. For them, liberation was not just a dream, but also a deadly gamble. Still, the whispers grew louder. Resistance leaders received coded radio messages from the BBC in London, absurd-seeming phrases that carried hidden meaning. "The dice are on the carpet. John has a long mustache." For most listeners, they were nonsense. For the resistance, they were signals, warnings, instructions, and promises that the invasion was coming. By the spring of 1944, there was no doubt that something immense was about to happen. German authorities sensed it too, increasing patrols, tightening control, and arresting more suspected resistors. Rommel himself declared that the coming battle would decide the fate of Germany. And yet, among the occupied peoples, hope grew stronger. In the cafes of Paris, whispered conversations spoke of liberation armies. In the countryside of Normandy, peasants dug up hidden flags, tucked away since 1940, waiting to be flown again. Liberation was a dream, fragile yet indestructible. It lived in the pages of clandestine newspapers, in the scratches of pens writing coded letters, in the footsteps of couriers on country roads. It lived in the silent courage of villagers who hid strangers in their barns, in the prayers of mothers who tucked their children into bed with the promise that someday soon, the world would change. And above all, it lived in the conviction that history could not end in darkness, that the tide of war, however long delayed, would turn, that one day, across the channel, the ships would come. By the spring of 1944, the war in Europe had reached a terrible equilibrium. In the east, the Red Army had clawed its way back from the brink of annihilation. At Stalingrad, it had broken the Wehrmacht, and at Kursk, it had crushed Hitler's last great gamble. Now, the Soviets pressed westward, grinding forward at unspeakable cost. In the south, the Allies had invaded Italy, yet progress there was slow, each mile paid for in blood. The true decision, everyone knew, would come in the west. It was here, in the shadowed rooms of London and Washington, that the weight of decision pressed most heavily. The question was not whether an invasion of France would come, but when, where, and how. At the heart of this debate stood the three great leaders of the Allied world. Franklin Roosevelt, weary from years of war and illness, knew that his country held the industrial power to tip the balance. Winston Churchill, haunted by memories of the trenches of 1914, feared a premature assault would only lead to slaughter. And Joseph Stalin, watching from Moscow as millions of his soldiers died on the steppe, demanded action with increasing fury. For Stalin, every month's delay meant another 100,000 graves dug into Russian soil. The negotiations were as brutal as any battlefield. At Tehran, the first meeting of the Big Three, Stalin pressed his allies relentlessly. He demanded a second front in 1943, then 1944, dismissing Allied excuses as cowardice or treachery. Churchill, ever the strategist of empire, argued for attacks through Italy, the Balkans, or the Mediterranean's soft underbellies, he called them, where British interests also lay. Roosevelt, mindful of American impatience, pushed for the direct assault on France. At last, the decision was made. There would be an invasion across the Channel. Its name was Operation Overlord. Its commander would be a man little known outside military circles, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not chosen for his battlefield victories. In truth, he had never commanded in battle. But he had something rarer, the ability to manage egos, to smooth the endless quarrels between British and American generals, to hold together a coalition of nations often united only by necessity. It was a quality as valuable as any weapon. For if Overlord was to succeed, it would depend not only on strategy and firepower, but on trust. Yet the decisions that confronted Eisenhower were enough to break any man. Where should the landings fall? The obvious choice, the Pas-de-Calais, was the closest point between Britain and France. But that very obviousness made it the best defended place on the continent. German fortifications there bristled with artillery, bunkers, and machine gun nests. Normandy, by contrast, was less defended, though its beaches were treacherous and its roads narrow. To gamble on Normandy was to risk everything on surprise. Then there was the question of when. The invasion required the perfect balance of tide, moonlight, and weather. Too soon, and the armies might drown in the surf. Too late, and the war might slip beyond control. Meteorologists studied the skies with a desperation matched only by the soldiers who would depend on them. Beyond these practical concerns lay deeper questions. Could the Allies truly sustain the supply lines across the Channel? Could they land not just men, but tanks, ammunition, fuel, and food in the vast quantities modern war demanded? To solve this, engineers planned miracles: floating harbors, pipelines running under the sea, tanks that could swim, gliders that could carry entire jeeps. Each invention was a gamble, untested on the scale that would soon be required. And always, in the background, lay the politics. Churchill pressed for delays, arguing that the Allies must first secure victory in Italy. Stalin pressed for haste, threatening to strike a separate peace if the West did not act. Roosevelt, aware of his coming election, needed to show his people that American lives and treasure were buying more than a stalemate. Each man pulled at the others, even as they swore loyalty to a common cause. For Eisenhower, the burden was crushing. In his diary, he wrote of sleepless nights, of the knowledge that the lives of thousands, perhaps the fate of civilization itself, depended on his judgment. He knew that if Overlord failed, the war might drag on for years more. And he knew that failure would not be measured in strategy, but in the bodies of young men lying face down in the surf. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Adolf Hitler and his generals debated the same questions from the opposite side. They knew the invasion would come. The only question was where. Hitler believed firmly that it would fall at the Pas-de-Calais. His generals urged him to keep panzer divisions ready to strike anywhere along the coast. But Hitler, increasingly distrustful, insisted on personally holding authority to release his reserves. In the crucial hours of June, that decision would prove decisive. For the German commander of the Western Front, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the challenge was immense. He had inspected the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vast system of coastal defenses, and found it wanting. Concrete bunkers and gun emplacements lined the shores, but Rommel knew they were not enough. The first 24 hours will be decisive, he warned. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome, for the Allies as well as for us. It will be the longest day. Thus, by the spring of 1944, Europe hung suspended between fear and hope, between delay and decision. In the villages of Normandy, peasants sowed their fields, unaware that in a few months their land would be scarred by fire and steel. In London, Eisenhower pored over maps, weighing lives against lives, knowing that every choice closed one door and opened another. In Moscow, Stalin waited, counting each day as a betrayal. And in Washington, Roosevelt prayed that history would not remember him as the man who hesitated. The weight of the decision was unbearable. Yet still, decisions had to be made. And in that fragile balance of judgment, courage, and chance, the future of Europe was being written. On the night of June 5, 1944, Britain did not sleep. Across its southern coast, in villages, ports, and hidden fields, the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen was preparing to move. More than 5,000 ships waited in harbors from Portsmouth to Plymouth, their decks crowded with men, tanks, trucks, and supplies. Overhead, bombers and transports lined the runways of England's airfields, engines humming in the dark. The invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, was about to begin. The Channel, that narrow strip of sea which for centuries had shielded Britain from conquest, now became the very path by which liberation would come. For 1,000 years, no force had crossed it on such a scale. The last invader to try was Napoleon. The last to succeed was William the Conqueror, almost 9 centuries earlier. Now, the Allies are prepared to reverse the story, not to conquer Britain from Europe, but to free Europe from tyranny. The task was staggering. Nearly 156,000 soldiers would be carried across the water in the first wave alone. Behind them, millions more would follow. To feed and arm them, the Allies had assembled not just an army, but a moving continent. Vehicles, aircraft, weapons, fuel, and food in numbers that defied imagination. In British fields, rows of tanks stretched to the horizon. On the beaches of southern England, landing craft lay packed together like driftwood after a storm. Even the skies seemed choked with wings. It was a logistical achievement unlike any in human history. To sustain an army across the sea, engineers had conceived ideas that bordered on the fantastical. Great floating harbors, the mulberries were built in secret, designed to be towed across the channel and assembled like building blocks on the Normandy coast. From England to France, under the waves, ran a pipeline, Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, through which oil would flow to fuel the invasion's tanks and trucks. These marvels of engineering, devised in workshops and shipyards, were as vital to the invasion as any weapon. But the true weight of the operation was carried not by machines, but by men. On the eve of the crossing, soldiers wrote hurried letters home, some sealing them with trembling hands. They shared cigarettes, whispered jokes to mask their fear, and stared into the darkness, knowing that for many, this night would be their last. In the holds of ships, seasick men lay packed shoulder to shoulder, clutching rifles and rosaries. They sang quietly or prayed silently as the waves rocked them toward destiny. Among them were young Americans who had never seen Europe before, Canadian farm boys who had never left their provinces, British veterans hardened by years of war, and free French who dreamed of walking their homeland again. Together, they represented a coalition of nations, bound by a cause greater than themselves. Yet each was also an individual, caught in the most momentous gamble of their age. The crossing itself was an act of both daring and faith. The English Channel, so narrow on a map, was treacherous in reality. Its tides could tear landing craft apart. Its waves could swamp tanks before they reached the shore. The weather in early June was notoriously unpredictable. Indeed, the invasion had already been delayed once, postponed by storms that lashed the coast. On the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower gathered his commanders. Meteorologists offered a brief window of a single day of break in the weather before the storms would return. If they waited, the invasion would have to be delayed for weeks, perhaps months. If they went ahead, they risked disaster at sea. Eisenhower listened in silence, then made the choice. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's go." That decision carried the weight of history. In his pocket, Eisenhower carried a handwritten note. In it, he took full responsibility should the invasion fail. He wrote that the troops had done their duty bravely, but that the failure was his alone. That note, folded and sealed, was the measure of the gamble he was taking. As the convoy set out, the channel became a vast highway of steel and flesh. From the decks of ships, men watched the coastline of England recede into the mist. In their hearts lay the knowledge that they were leaving safety behind, heading into a storm of fire. High above them, swarms of aircraft thundered across the skies. More than 11,000 planes would be committed to the invasion. Bombers softening German defenses, fighters patrolling the skies, transports carrying paratroopers to the fields of Normandy. For German civilians and soldiers alike, the drone of Allied engines filled the night like the sound of approaching doom. Yet even as this armada moved, secrecy remained essential. The Allies had spent months deceiving the Germans into believing the main invasion would come at Calais. Dummy camps had been built in England, filled with wooden tanks and fake radio chatter. General Patton, sidelined after controversy, had been placed at the head of a fictitious First U.S. Army group, intended to convince German intelligence that he would lead the attack. The deception Operation Fortitude had worked so well that even as the ships crossed, Hitler remained convinced that Normandy was only a diversion. Meanwhile, on the French coast, German sentries scanned the horizon. The Atlantic Wall, that mighty chain of bunkers and defenses, stretched for thousands of miles. But on this night, most German commanders slept. Rommel himself was away in Germany, visiting his family for his wife's birthday. Others believed no invasion could come in such poor weather. Only a handful of radar operators and watchmen glimpsed the signs of what was to come, too late to raise the alarm. For those on board the Allied ships, the hours before dawn stretched endlessly. Some slept fitfully, others lay awake, haunted by thoughts of home. Chaplains moved among the men, offering prayers and comfort. Officers checked and rechecked their orders. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, in the darkness before dawn, the first waves began. Paratroopers, leaping into the black skies above Normandy, scattered across the fields and hedgerows. Gliders, creaking and fragile, descended into meadows and marshes. The men who landed there fought in silence, their mission to seize bridges, cut roads, and throw the German rear into chaos. They were the vanguard of the storm. Behind them, the great fleet pressed on. By sunrise, the beaches of Normandy lay in sight. The water was choked with ships, the horizon filled with the silhouettes of war. Soldiers gripped their weapons, staring at the shore where their fate would be decided. The crossing of the channel was complete. Ahead lay the fire of the Atlantic Wall. Ahead lay Omaha, Juno, Gold, Sword, and Utah, the names that would soon be carved into history. And as the gray dawn broke over the water, the world entered a day unlike any other. Long before the first landing craft touched the beaches of Normandy, the invasion had already begun. In the midnight hours of June 6, 1944, the skies above France filled with the thunder of engines. Thousands of paratroopers, packed into the darkened bellies of aircraft, waited for the order that would fling them into history. Their mission was to fall behind enemy lines, to seize bridges and crossroads, to sow confusion among the German defenders. They would be the first to set foot in occupied France. The men of the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne, the British 6th Airborne, and Free French Commandos carried no illusions. They knew their task was perilous. They would descend into darkness, scattered across fields and marshes, far from support. For many, it would be their first time under fire. Yet in their pockets they carried maps, compasses, and in some cases small cards printed with French phrases, reminders that they were not only soldiers, but emissaries of liberation. The night itself was thick with tension. As the planes roared across the channel, men stood in the narrow aisles, weighed down with gear. Each paratrooper carried up to 100 pounds, rifles, ammunition, grenades, radios, even collapsible bicycles. Sweat ran down their faces despite the cold air. Some prayed silently. Others joked loudly, masking their fear in bravado. Then the red light came on. The moment had arrived. Over Normandy, the dark fields below glimmered faintly in moonlight, broken by flashes of German flak. Anti-aircraft fire clawed at the sky, exploding among the formations. Planes jolted violently, some spiraling down in flames. The green light flashed. The jump masters shouted, "Go! Go! Go!" And the men hurled themselves into the void. The night sky became a spectacle of silk and fire. Parachutes blossomed against the darkness, lit by tracer rounds and explosions. Some men drifted gently to earth. Others plummeted into rivers, swamps, and trees. Many were killed before their boots touched the ground, shot in the air by waiting German gunners. For those who survived the descent, the ordeal had only begun. Units were scattered across the countryside, often miles from their drop zones. Radios failed, maps were lost, and landmarks were obscured by the hedgerows, those ancient walls of earth and foliage that turned Normandy into a maze. Small groups of paratroopers stumbled through the night, searching for their comrades, fighting skirmishes with German patrols, or hiding in barns until dawn. The chaos was immense. Some units, like the 101st Airborne, landed so far from their objectives that entire operations had to be improvised on the spot. Others, such as the British 6th Airborne, managed to find their targets despite confusion. In one of the most daring feats of the night, British glider troops captured Pegasus Bridge, a key crossing over the Caen Canal. With a sudden, violent assault, they secured it intact, holding it against repeated German counterattacks. That single action prevented German armor from reaching the beaches at dawn, a moment that would prove crucial to the invasion's success. Elsewhere, isolated paratroopers waged their own private wars. A handful of Americans seized crossroads, cutting off German reinforcements. Others ambushed convoys, derailed trains, and destroyed communications. In the village of St. Miraglise, a fire lit up the night sky as paratroopers drifted down. Some landed in the town square, directly under the gaze of German defenders. One soldier, John Steele, became famously entangled on the church steeple, feigning death as the battle raged below. The bravery of these men was matched only by their confusion. Many fought not as battalions or companies, but as small clusters of men, often strangers, bound together by circumstance. Leaders emerged from necessity. Privates took command when officers fell. In the hedgerows and lanes, the battle became a matter of instinct, courage, and improvisation. For the Germans, the night was one of disarray. Reports flooded in from every direction. Parachutes sighted here, gliders landing there, bridges under attack. To the defenders, it seemed as though an entire army had descended from the sky. German commanders hesitated, unsure whether these were diversionary raids or the main assault. Some units reacted with speed and ferocity. Others remained paralyzed, waiting for orders from higher command. The fog of war spread as thickly on their side as on the Allies. And so the longest night dragged on. Through the dark hours, paratroopers fought alone and in groups, seizing ground inch by inch. Some were captured. Others were executed on the spot by vengeful defenders. But many survived, forming pockets of resistance that disrupted German lines throughout Normandy. By dawn, the airborne mission stood on a knife's edge. Casualties were high, objectives uncertain, and the scattered forces were still gathering. Yet they had achieved what mattered most. They had sown confusion in the German rear. Bridges were held, crossroads contested, and communication shattered. The Atlantic Wall's defenders, already spread thin, were now uncertain where to turn. And as the sun began to rise over Normandy, the sea itself turned to fire. The great armada of ships that had crossed the channel now loomed offshore, its guns pounding the coast. Landing craft surged toward the beaches, their decks crammed with soldiers. The paratroopers, still fighting in the fields, would soon hear the roar of naval bombardment, the thunder of tanks, and the clash of infantry. The longest night was over. The longest day had begun. As the first light of June 6, 1944, broke over the waters of Normandy, the Armada revealed its full magnitude. Stretching from horizon to horizon, more than 5,000 ships filled the channel. Transports, destroyers, battleships, and landing craft. The thunder of naval guns shook the morning air as great shells screamed toward the French coast, exploding along the beaches and bluffs. It was the prelude to the most dangerous moment of the invasion, the assault on the Atlantic Wall. At Omaha Beach, the American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions prepared for what awaited them. Packed into small landing craft, seasick and drenched from the churning waves, they had endured hours of terror as German artillery and mortars splashed around them. Each man carried over 60 pounds of equipment, rifles, grenades, packs, entrenching tools, and as they drew near the shore, the ramps clattered down. The invasion of Europe had begun, but Omaha was unlike any of the other beaches. Here, the German defenses were strongest. High bluffs overlooked the sand, bristling with concrete bunkers, machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The beach itself was a killing ground, wide, exposed, and littered with obstacles: wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, mines, and barbed wire, all designed to trap landing craft and slow men under fire. Rommel had overseen these defenses himself, determined to crush any invader in the first moments of the assault. As the first waves of Americans splashed into the surf, the trap was sprung. Machine guns opened fire from concealed positions, cutting down men before they reached the sand. Mortar rounds exploded among the landing craft, sending bodies and wreckage into the water. Entire units were annihilated within minutes. Landing craft drifted aimlessly, burning, while survivors leapt into the sea, struggling ashore under the weight of their gear. Many drowned before they could even fire a shot. The chaos was total. Radios failed, commanders were killed, and units dissolved into fragments. On the beach, men hugged the sand, trapped beneath murderous fire. Corpses floated in the surf, waves stained red. Tanks intended to support the infantry sank before reaching shore, swamped by the rough seas. Officers tried to rally their men, but were cut down in the attempt. For those caught in the cauldron of Omaha, survival itself became an act of defiance. Yet amidst the carnage, acts of courage began to turn the tide. Small groups of soldiers, realizing they would die if they stayed pinned down, began to crawl forward. Engineers braved fire to clear obstacles with explosives, blasting open narrow paths through the wire. Rangers, trained for assaults on cliffs, scaled the bluffs under fire, silencing machine guns with grenades and rifles. A handful of tanks that had made it ashore opened fire on the bunkers, giving the infantry moments of reprieve. The battle devolved into dozens of desperate, isolated fights. A squad would storm a bunker, then hold it with only a few survivors. Others would crawl through shell craters, using the dead for cover, inching toward the German lines. Officers who survived found themselves leading men from shattered units, cobbling together forces from whoever remained alive. At one point, General Omar Bradley, watching from the fleet offshore, considered calling off the assault. The losses were staggering, the beach a slaughterhouse. But the men ashore could not retreat. They had only one choice: forward or death. Slowly, painfully, they pushed inland. By midday, through sheer will and sacrifice, the tide began to turn. Small groups reached the base of the bluffs, where they fought hand-to-hand against German defenders. Grenades and flamethrowers cleared out bunkers, one by one. Snipers on the heights were silenced. Once the first cracks appeared in the German line, more men surged through. The defenders, realizing the Americans were inside their positions, began to fall back. The price was terrible. By the end of the day, Over 2,000 Americans had been killed, wounded, or were missing. Omaha Beach was littered with the wreckage of war, burned-out vehicles, shattered landing craft, and bodies strewn across the tide line. Survivors described it as hell on earth, a place where every second felt like an eternity. And yet, despite everything, Omaha was secured. The beach had held. The Atlantic Wall had not been invincible after all. The men who clawed their way off that sand had done so not through overwhelming firepower, but through raw determination. In the cauldron of Omaha, the invasion had nearly been lost. Instead, it became a testament to endurance. Across Normandy, the other beaches told different stories, some easier, some nearly as bloody. But none matched Omaha for its ferocity. Here, in the bloodied surf, the fate of D-Day itself had hung by a thread. While the Americans at Omaha clawed their way out of hell, the story was not the same across every beach. The Normandy invasion was a mosaic of experiences, each beachhead shaped by chance, preparation, and the defenders who faced them. To understand D-Day in its entirety, we must move beyond Omaha's slaughter and into the parallel struggles of Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword. At the westernmost edge of the invasion lay Utah Beach, assigned to the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. Fate intervened before the first shot was fired. Strong currents carried the landing craft nearly 2 kilometers south of their intended position. But what could have been a disaster turned into an unexpected advantage. The new landing zone was less heavily defended, with weaker fortifications and fewer German troops. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., arriving with the very first wave despite a limp from old wounds, surveyed the scene calmly. Realizing they were off course, he is remembered for his understated words, "We'll start the war from right here." Under his leadership, the Americans advanced rapidly inland. Engineers cleared obstacles, paratroopers linked up from the night before, and by mid-morning, Utah was secure. Losses were relatively light, around 200 men killed or wounded. Compared to Omaha, it was a victory almost charmed by fortune, a reminder of how random currents and small decisions could shape the course of history. Further east, the Canadians stormed Juno Beach. Here, the fighting mirrored Omaha's ferocity. The first waves were cut down by machine gun fire and obstacles as they fought their way through surf and sand. The Canadians of the 3rd Infantry Division, supported by tanks of the 2nd Armored Brigade, pressed forward against brutal resistance. Whole sections of beach became killing zones, but the Canadians refused to yield. Slowly, they punched through. By midday, Juno had achieved the deepest penetration of all 5 beaches. Yet this success came at a cost. Nearly 1 in 10 men who landed that morning were killed or wounded. The sands of Juno were a place of both pride and sacrifice, a testament to Canada's determination to stand alongside its allies. At Gold Beach, British forces of the 50th Infantry Division waded ashore. Their objective was ambitious: to secure a beachhead, seize the town of Bayou, and link up with the Canadians on their left. The Germans, manning strong points and artillery, made the approach deadly. Yet here, British planning and the arrival of specialized armor, so-called Hobart's funnies, tipped the balance. These strange vehicles, fitted with flails to detonate mines, ramps to cross obstacles, and mortars to crush fortifications, battered their way through the Atlantic Wall. By afternoon, Gold was secure, though resistance in the countryside would continue to delay their push toward Bayou. On the far eastern flank lay Sword Beach, also attacked by the British. Their objective was crucial: push inland, seize Cannes, and protect the flank of the entire invasion. The landing itself succeeded with relatively modest casualties compared to Omaha or Juno. But as the British pressed inland, they encountered stiff resistance from Germany's 21st Panzer Division, one of the few armored units stationed near the coast. In a fierce afternoon counterattack, German tanks nearly reached the beach itself, threatening to split the invasion in two. Only the arrival of Allied air power and naval gunfire halted them, forcing the panzers to withdraw. Sword was held, but would remain a bitter prize, fought over for weeks to come. When we step back and view the invasion as a whole, the picture is clear. D-Day was not a single story, but a tapestry. Omaha was a cauldron of death, Utah a near miracle, Juno a bloody struggle, Gold and Sword hard-fought but secure. Each beach reflected both the strength of the German defenses and the will of the Allies to overcome them. But beyond the tactical details, what made D-Day unique was its multinational character. Americans, British, and Canadians formed the bulk of the assault, but they were joined by Free French commandos fighting to liberate their own soil, by Norwegians, Poles, and Czechs exiles who had refused to surrender, by Greeks and Dutch sailors who crewed Allied ships, by Belgians who stormed the beaches alongside larger armies. On the water and in the air, New Zealanders and Australians played their part. Even distant colonies contributed men and resources. For the first time in history, such a vast coalition had gathered not just to conquer, but to liberate. Each soldier carried with him the hope of nations, some to free their homelands, others to avenge fallen comrades, all to bring an end to tyranny. This unity of purpose gave the invasion a moral force that the German defenders, many weary from years of war, could not match. Yet it would be a mistake to see D-Day as inevitable. The German defenders fought with grim determination. In many strongpoints, they held out to the last bullet. At Juno and Sword, counterattacks with armor nearly succeeded. The Atlantic Wall, for all its flaws, exacted a heavy price. But in the end, it was not enough. The sheer weight of Allied numbers, the coordination of land, sea, and air, and above all, the courage of ordinary men pressed forward until the wall cracked. By nightfall, all 5 beaches were linked. The Allies had landed 156,000 troops in a single day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Losses were grievous. Over 10,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, yet the beachheads held. Behind them poured reinforcements, supplies, tanks, and artillery. The door to France had been forced open. Ahead lay the hedgerows, the bocage country, and the long march to Paris. But the hardest part was done. The Allies were ashore. In the villages of Normandy, French civilians watched with disbelief. For years, they had lived under the shadow of occupation rationing, curfews, repression, and fear of the Gestapo. Now, on June 6, 1944, they saw men from across the world fighting to liberate their land. For many, it was the first glimmer of hope that the nightmare might soon end. D-Day was a turning point not just militarily, but morally. It showed that free nations, divided by language and distance, could unite for a common cause. And it demonstrated that even the strongest walls, built on oppression, could be torn down when confronted by determination, courage, and sacrifice. As the sun set over Normandy on June 6th, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold. But on the other side of the lines, in the bunkers, command posts, and headquarters of Hitler's Reich, the reality of the invasion was only just sinking in. For the German defenders, D-Day was not a single shock, but a wave of confusion. From the moment the first paratroopers fell through the night sky, messages poured into German command centers, scattered reports of fighting in villages, explosions on bridges, mysterious landings along the coast. Yet the truth was obscured by chaos. Were these diversions? Where would the real blow fall? For years, the German High Command had anticipated an Allied invasion of Western Europe. The Great Defensive Project known as the Atlantic Wall had consumed vast resources: concrete bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and barbed wire, stretching from Norway to the Spanish frontier. But the wall was strongest where the Germans believed the Allies must come: the narrow straits around the Pas-de-Calais. Here lay Hitler's dilemma. Convinced that the Allies' assault would fall at Calais, Many in Berlin believed that the Normandy landings were a feint. This belief was not entirely irrational. The Allies had carefully nurtured the deception known as Operation Fortitude. Fake armies under General Patton were positioned in Kent. Phantom radio traffic was generated. Inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft filled fields. German spies, some doubled by Allied intelligence, reported sightings that confirmed their suspicions. Even when thousands of Allied ships appeared off Normandy, Hitler's mind clung to the idea that the real attack was still to come. This deception paralyzed the German response. The Wehrmacht had armored divisions in France, but their deployment was tangled in bureaucracy and Hitler's personal control. Rommel, the Desert Fox, tasked with defending the coast, had argued that the panzers should be stationed close to the beaches, ready to strike before the Allies could consolidate. But others insisted they be held back as a strategic reserve. The result was compromise, and compromise, in war, is often fatal. On D-Day itself, many armored divisions were too far inland to respond quickly. Worse, Hitler himself was asleep when the invasion began, and his staff hesitated to wake him. No panzer units could be released without his direct authorization. Hours slipped by as commanders argued and waited. By the time Hitler finally gave the order, the beaches had been stormed, and the Allies had established their footholds. Rommel himself was not even in Normandy when the invasion began. Convinced bad weather would delay any assault, he had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. As the paratroopers dropped and the fleet surged across the channel, one of Germany's most capable commanders was away from the battlefield. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that would haunt him in the months to come. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine that the German defenders simply folded. On the beaches, in the villages, and across the Bocage countryside, they fought with grim determination. At Omaha, their machine guns had inflicted devastating losses. At Juno and Sword, their counterattacks had threatened to drive the Allies back into the sea. German artillery, mortars, and sniper fire harassed every step inland. Even in retreat, they imposed a terrible cost. One of the first significant responses came from the 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen. By the afternoon of June 6th, they launched a counterattack against the British at Sword Beach. Columns of panzers rolled forward, their black crosses gleaming in the summer sun. For a moment, it seemed the invasion might collapse. British infantry, pinned down, awaited the hammer blow. But Allied naval gunners and aircraft answered with thunder. Waves of Typhoon fighter bombers streaked overhead, rockets screaming into the German armor. The counterattack faltered, and the panzers withdrew. The invasion, though bloodied, had survived its most dangerous test. Elsewhere, German units attempted to regroup, but confusion reigned. Communications were disrupted by Allied bombing and sabotage from the French resistance. Bridges had been blown, supply lines severed. Many divisions moved not at the pace of tanks, but at the crawl of bicycles, carts, and marching feet. Against the vast machinery of Allied logistics, the endless convoys of ships and aircraft crossing the channel, the Germans found themselves outpaced at every turn. Hitler's own role in this paralysis cannot be ignored. Obsessed with controlling details, mistrustful of his generals, he delayed critical decisions. Convinced that Normandy was a diversion, he withheld key reinforcements for days. By the time he committed the powerful 1st SS Panzer Corps, the Allies had already begun to build their artificial harbors, the mulberries, and were pouring men and material into France. The chance to throw them back had passed. For the men on the ground, however, this larger picture was invisible. German soldiers in the bunkers, villages, and hedgerows fought with a mixture of fear, duty, and fatalism. Many were young conscripts, some barely out of school, drawn from across occupied Europe. Others were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, transferred west to face a new enemy. They fought not for Hitler's grand strategy, but for their lives, for their comrades, for the ground beneath their feet. As night fell on June 6th, the German commanders faced the truth. The Allies were ashore, their beachheads holding firm. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The long-feared invasion had come, and the Reich had been caught unprepared. The battle for Normandy had only begun, but the tide of the war was turning. From this moment on, Germany would fight not to expand, but to hold. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was shrinking. And as Allied troops dug into the beaches, building roads and depots under fire, the Germans faced a grim reality. The war was no longer being fought on Hitler-esque terms. The beaches of Normandy had been held. By the evening of June 6th, the Allies had landed 156,000 men, 10,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of equipment. Against all odds, against fire and steel, the Atlantic Wall had cracked. Yet this was only the beginning. To hold the beaches was one thing. To break out of them and roll back the Reich was another. The true measure of D-Day was not just in the storming of sand and surf, but in what followed, the transformation of a tenuous foothold into a relentless flood. Even as the fighting raged on the beaches, Allied engineers were already at work on the next phase of the invasion. Across the Channel, convoys continued to sail, bringing not only troops, but an entire civilization of war: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, vehicles, and the means to sustain them. For an invasion on such a scale, the beaches themselves could not suffice. Ports were needed, but the Germans held every major harbor. The solution was audacious. The Allies would build their own. In secret, engineers had designed vast prefabricated harbors, the mulberries. These artificial ports, consisting of floating roadways, concrete caissons, and massive breakwaters, were towed across the Channel and sunk into place off Normandy. Within days, the barren shoreline was transformed into a logistical hub. Trucks and tanks rolled ashore along floating causeways. Cranes unloaded ships directly onto the beaches. For the first time in history, an army had carried its own harbors across the sea. Without the mulberries, the invasion might have faltered. With them, it became unstoppable. By mid-June, more than 500,000 men and 100,000 vehicles had crossed into France. But logistics alone could not win the battle. Inland, the terrain of Normandy offered the Germans a natural fortress. The Bocage country, with its thick hedgerows, narrow lanes, and sunken roads, turned every field into a defensive strongpoint. German soldiers, skilled in defense and armed with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons, made the Allies pay for every hedgerow. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. Casualties mounted. For the men who had survived the beaches, the hedgerows proved a new kind of nightmare. It was here that the German army revealed its resilience. Units that had been shattered on June 6th regrouped, reinforced by divisions drawn from across France. Among them were elements of the Waffen-SS, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front who fought with brutal efficiency. In villages and fields, they counterattacked ferociously, often fighting to the last man. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Entire towns were reduced to rubble. At Caen, the British and Canadians faced a particularly grueling struggle. The city was a key objective on D-Day, but German resistance proved too fierce. For weeks, British forces launched operation after operation to seize the city, each time checked by stubborn defense and counterattacks. Caen became a symbol of the attritional grind of the Normandy campaign, a battle not won in a day, but in weeks of blood and sacrifice. Yet even as the Allies bled, the Germans were bleeding more. Allied control of the skies turned every daylight movement into a gamble. Trains, convoys, and reinforcements were bombed with ruthless precision. Bridges were destroyed, supply lines severed. Resistance fighters, emboldened by the landings, launched sabotage missions across France, cutting telephone lines, derailing trains, and ambushing convoys. German soldiers began to feel the noose tightening. The turning point came not with a single stroke, but with the steady accumulation of pressure. Day by day, the Allies poured more men and material into Normandy. German divisions, already stretched thin, found themselves unable to match the pace. Where the Allies could replace losses, the Germans could not. The climax came in late July, with Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the bocage. After weeks of grinding stalemate, U.S. forces unleashed a massive aerial bombardment, blasting a hole in the German lines. Tanks and infantry surged forward, bypassing strong points, encircling defenders, and driving deep into the French countryside. The German front collapsed. For the first time since the invasion began, the Allies were no longer confined to the beaches and hedgerows. They were advancing across open country, mobile and unstoppable. Town after town was liberated. French civilians greeted their liberators with tears and joy. In Paris, whispers of freedom spread once more. The tide had turned irreversibly. What had begun as a desperate gamble on June 6th had, by late summer, become a rolling avalanche. The Germans, who once dreamed of defending a thousand-year Reich, were now in retreat. The Allies had created what they had long sought, a true Western Front. But victory in Normandy came at a terrible cost. Allied casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. German losses were even greater, with entire divisions shattered. Civilians paid a heavy price. The bombing of towns, the destruction of villages, and the suffering of those caught between two armies. Normandy was not just a battlefield, but a graveyard. And yet, for all its horror, it was also a beginning. From the beaches of Normandy, the road to Paris was opened. From Paris, the road to the Rhine. And from the Rhine, the road to Berlin itself. D-Day was no longer a question of survival. It was the opening act of victory, the moment when the balance of World War II shifted and the future of Europe was rewritten. For all the maps, strategies, and sweeping movements of armies, the truth of D-Day and the Normandy campaign that followed lies not in charts or plans, but in the lives of the men and women who endured it. The liberation of Europe was written in the small acts of courage, in the final words of soldiers, in the silence of those who never returned. On the beaches, the sands became graveyards. Many of those who fell on June 6th were scarcely more than boys, 18, 19, 20 years old. They carried with them letters, photographs, keepsakes, reminders of lives interrupted. Some wrote hurried notes as they crossed the channel, words meant for mothers, wives, or sweethearts. Many of those letters would be delivered not by their own hands, but by military couriers after the news of their death. At Omaha, survivors recalled clinging to the shingle while the sea turned red around them. In the chaos, some whispered prayers, others shouted for medics, and many lay silent. A soldier later described it simply: "You could taste the fear, as real as the salt water in your mouth." For every man who made it off the sand, another did not. Their names, etched on headstones, tell the story more eloquently than any historian could. In the skies above Normandy, paratroopers leapt into darkness. One remembered hearing the rattle of machine guns, the thump of flak shells, and the cries of men who never made it to the ground alive. Others landed in flooded fields and drowned beneath the weight of their equipment. A young officer, writing in his diary before the drop, admitted, "I do not expect to return. If I fall, let it be said that I did my duty." His words, preserved by his family, became his only monument. The Canadians at Juno spoke of villages reduced to ruins, of pushing past burning houses where civilians huddled in cellars. One veteran recalled seeing a French family waving from their doorway, tears streaming down their faces as Canadian troops fought street by street. For them, liberation was bought not in speeches, but in blood. At gold and sword, British and Free French soldiers advanced through coastal towns where the dead lay unburied, where gardens and orchards became battlegrounds. The clash of steel and the cries of the wounded echoed against centuries-old stone. Amid the gunfire, there were moments of humanity, a British medic tending both Allied and German wounded, a French child given chocolate by a soldier, smiling for the first time in years. And among the defenders, too, there were voices of the fallen. Many German soldiers had no illusions about the war they fought. Some had been transferred from the Eastern Front, already scarred by years of combat. Others were conscripts from occupied countries, wearing the uniform of an army they did not choose. Letters from German soldiers speak not of glory, but of longing for home, for safety, for an end. They, too, left families who would wait for news that never came. Civilians, caught between armies, bore their own suffering. In Norman villages, families fled burning houses, carrying children through fields riddled with shellfire. Farmers saw their herds destroyed, their homes flattened, their lives overturned in a single day. Some embraced the Allies with joy, offering wine and bread. Others grieved quietly for the sons lost on both sides, for the neighbors taken in reprisals, for the world that could never be restored. The cemeteries of Normandy tell this story more than any speech. At Colleville-sur-Mer, above Omaha Beach, row upon row of white crosses and stars of David stretch across the grass, each marking a life cut short. At Benny-sur-Mer, Canadian headstones carry the names of those who fell on Juno. At Ranville, British paratroopers rest near the fields where they landed. German cemeteries, too, lie across Normandy, their darker stones grouped, silent reminders that death did not discriminate between uniforms. Walking among these graves, one is struck not by the numbers, but by the ages. 17, 19, 21, an entire generation caught in the tide of history. Each grave was once a child's laughter, a family's hope, a future unwritten. Collectively, they form the human cost of D-Day, not just a military victory, but a sacrifice beyond measure. Historians can chart how the invasion succeeded the Mulberry Harbors, the deception plans, and air superiority. But the true weight of D-Day rests in the simple truth that men went forward when they might have turned back. They endured what no one should have to endure because they believed the task was greater than themselves. One survivor, reflecting years later, said, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what must be done, even when fear consumes you." That sentiment captures the essence of June 6, 1944. Each man who stepped into the surf, who dropped from the sky, who advanced through hedgerows, carried within him both fear and duty. Some survived, many did not. The voices of the fallen are not only those of soldiers. They include the French families who lived through the thunder of artillery, who buried their dead in gardens and orchards. They include the resistance fighters executed in cellars and fields, their courage repaid with bullets. They include the countless civilians across Europe who had prayed for liberation and who now bore the scars of its arrival. Today, those voices can still be heard in diaries, in letters, in memorials. But above all, they are heard in the silence of the cemeteries, where the wind whispers across endless rows of stone. There, the price of freedom is inscribed not in speeches or monuments, but in names. In the gray hours before sunrise on June 6, 1944, Europe still lay in chains. The swastika flew over Paris, Warsaw, Oslo, Athens, and Amsterdam. The thunder of German boots echoed across half a continent. For nearly 5 years, the peoples of Europe had endured darkness, occupation, oppression, and fear. But with the arrival of D-Day, a new light began to break through the storm. It was not sudden. The liberation of Europe did not arrive with fanfare or triumph, but with struggle and loss. Yet for the first time since 1939, the tide of war had shifted irreversibly. Where once the German Reich had advanced without rival, now its enemies were at its gates, on its beaches, in its skies. In Normandy, The Allied foothold grew day by day. By the end of June, nearly 1 million soldiers had crossed the Channel, their camps spreading across the fields of northern France. The Mulberry harbors bustled with constant activity, ships unloading tanks, ammunition, food, and fuel, the lifeblood of a new campaign. The German defenders, once confident in their Atlantic wall, now found themselves on the defensive in every sense. Divisions bled white in the hedgerows. Panzer reserves rushed forward only to be destroyed by the air. Hitler, convinced that the main invasion would still come at Pas de Calais, held back critical reinforcements, leaving Normandy to bleed. By the time the truth dawned, it was too late. The Allies, however, did not advance easily. The bocage country of Normandy, a patchwork of fields divided by thick hedgerows and sunken lanes, became a nightmare battlefield. Every advance was contested, every hedgerow a fortress. Casualties mounted, and the dream of a swift breakout gave way to grinding attrition. Men who had survived the beaches now faced ambushes at every turn, snipers in every tree, artillery hidden beyond every ridge. And yet, the Allies endured. Slowly, inexorably, they broke through. American forces pushed inland from Omaha and Utah, capturing Corentin and linking their beachheads. Canadians advanced past Cannes, where fierce resistance turned the ancient city into ruins. British and Free French forces, too, pressed forward, taking town after town at staggering cost. For the French, the arrival of Allied troops was more than a military turning point. It was the rekindling of hope. In village after village, French civilians emerged from cellars and barns, greeting their liberators with tears, flowers, and flags hidden since 1940. Some rushed forward with bottles of wine. Others embraced strangers in Allied uniforms, whispering "Merci, merci." Children who had known nothing but occupation suddenly found themselves lifted onto the shoulders of soldiers, handed chocolate, chewing gum, or toys scavenged from rations. Yet liberation was never simple. Alongside the joy came grief. Many villages were destroyed in the fighting. Families mourned lost homes and lost loved ones. And darker shadows loomed. Retribution against collaborators, vengeance against those accused of aiding the occupiers. Liberation, while glorious, was also raw and fraught with the pains of years under tyranny. Still, the broader picture was undeniable, and the Allied anvil in the West could no longer hope to hold. The initiative had passed. The world had shifted. In London, Washington, and Ottawa, the news of Normandy's success was met with jubilation. Crowds gathered around radios and newspapers, tracking each advance. Churchill, ever the orator, reminded his people that while victory was not yet at hand, the path had been opened. Roosevelt, speaking to Americans, framed the invasion as both a military and spiritual struggle, calling upon citizens to pray for the men who fought in France. Across the Allied nations, bells rang, voices cheered, and long-suppressed optimism stirred. In Berlin, the news landed like a thunderclap. Goebbels' propaganda machine struggled to spin the invasion as a minor setback. Privately, German officers knew the truth. The Reich was cornered. The failure to hold Normandy meant the loss of France, and with it, the western flank. Already, whispers circulated that the war could not be won. But for those in the fields of Normandy, the light of dawn was less about strategy and more about survival. Each village taken, each ridge crossed, brought with it a sense that the nightmare was ending. Resistance fighters emerged more boldly now, cutting communication lines, sabotaging convoys, and guiding Allied troops through familiar terrain. Ordinary farmers offered food and shelter despite the risk. Liberation was no longer a distant dream. It was visible, tangible, embodied in the Allied advance. By late July, Operation Cobra, the American breakout, shattered German defenses. What had been a slow crawl through the hedgerows turned into a rolling tide. The Allies poured into the French countryside, sweeping through towns, encircling German forces, driving them back in disarray. Soon, Paris would rise in revolt, and the liberation of France would become unstoppable. Looking back, historians see D-Day not merely as the largest seaborne invasion in history, but as the decisive turning point in the West. Without Normandy, the war in Europe might have dragged on for years. With it, the Reich was doomed. The beginning of the end had come. But for the men who fought there, the meaning was simpler. One British soldier, writing years later, reflected, "On that morning, we knew that whatever else happened, we had turned the tide. We had set foot on a land that was not ours, to give it back to those it belonged to." And in that moment, in the smoke and the noise, there was a strange kind of light, the light of dawn. That light, fragile at first, would blaze across Europe in the months to come. From the fields of Normandy to the streets of Paris, from the forests of the Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin, the flame of liberation would spread. Today, when one walks the beaches of Normandy, the sand is quiet. The gulls wheel overhead, the tide rolls in and out, and the waves erase the footprints of the living just as they once tried to erase the marks of the dead. To the unknowing eye, these stretches of coastline look like any other. Ordinary beaches where children play, where families stroll, where fishermen mend their nets. But beneath the surface lies a story written in blood. The fields that once echoed with artillery fire are now green pastures. The hedgerows that once hid German machine guns now enclose peaceful farms. The villages, rebuilt from rubble, are once again places of laughter, church bells, and market days. But scattered across this land are reminders that history never truly vanishes. At Colleville-sur-Mer, above Omaha Beach, rows upon rows of white crosses stand in silence, stretching across the grass in perfect formation. Each marks a name, an age, a life cut short. Some bear the Star of David, others a simple cross. Some are known only to God. When the wind moves across them, it seems as if the dead themselves are whispering. Other cemeteries, Canadian at Benny-sur-Mer, British at Bayeux, German at La Cam, tell the same story of young men on every side, sacrificed to the machinery of war. The monuments and graves do not glorify the conflict. They remind us of its cost. Every June, world leaders gather here. Presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs stand where soldiers once fell. They lay wreaths, give speeches, and remind their nations of the meaning of freedom. Veterans, their numbers dwindling, return in wheelchairs or on unsteady legs, retracing the beaches they first saw as young men. French schoolchildren carry flowers to the graves of men they never met, yet to whom they owe their lives. For those who lived through it, the memory of D-Day was never abstract. It was the moment the war changed. A farmer in Normandy might remember the sudden thunder of guns and the arrival of strangers who spoke English but offered chocolate. A Canadian veteran might recall the desperate push through machine gun fire at Juno Beach. An American paratrooper might relive the chaos of being scattered across the countryside in the dead of night. Each story threads into the larger tapestry of memory. But memory is not only personal, it is political. The legacy of D-Day has shaped the very identity of nations. For the United States, it stands as proof of its role as the arsenal of democracy, a moment when American power turned the tide of global war. For Britain, it was the vindication of endurance after years of standing alone. The island nation had returned to the continent to strike back. For Canada, it became a marker of national sacrifice and independence, a day when Canadian divisions carved their own place in history. For France, it was the beginning of rebirth, the moment the long shadow of occupation began to lift. Even for Germany, the legacy of D-Day remains. The defeat on the beaches marked not only a military failure, but a moral reckoning. Today, German visitors to Normandy often come with humility, reflecting on a war their ancestors fought and on the cost of tyranny. And beyond the nations directly involved, the invasion has taken on a global significance. For many, D-Day symbolizes the very idea of liberation, a collective effort against oppression, a moment when free nations united to overthrow a dictatorship. In the decades since, it has become a touchstone in the way the modern world thinks about freedom, sacrifice, and the defense of civilization. Yet the memory is also complex. D-Day was not a single, clean moment of victory. It was brutal, bloody, and costly. Tens of thousands died in the fighting that followed. Civilians, too, paid a terrible price. Entire towns were destroyed. Families were uprooted. And the liberation of Europe did not end in Normandy. There were months of struggle ahead. The breakout into France, the battles of the Ardennes, the final drive into Germany. To reduce D-Day to a triumphant myth risks forgetting the suffering it entailed. That is why historians, teachers, and filmmakers return to it again and again. Each new telling of the story seeks not only to preserve memory, but to deepen it to remind us that history is not just dates and battles, but lives lived and lost. In the digital age, the legacy of D-Day has entered new forms. Documentaries, podcasts, interactive maps, and virtual reality tours allow new generations to experience its story. Yet, even with these tools, the essential truth remains the same. D-Day was a human event, defined by courage, sacrifice, and the fragile line between life and death. For those who search for lessons, there are many. D-Day teaches us that freedom is not inevitable. It must be fought for, at terrible cost. It teaches us that cooperation between nations, however difficult, can achieve what once seemed impossible. And it teaches us that even in the darkest hour, light can return. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of all is the silence of those who never returned. They do not tell their stories. They do not attend the commemorations. Their voices are absent, and it is for us, the living, to carry them forward, to walk the beaches, to read the names on the stones, to speak their memory aloud. For as long as those stories are told, the light of dawn that broke on June 6, 1944, will not fade.